Hello, and welcome to Lore and Sleep. Tonight we travel back a little over a century to a cold, calm night in the North Atlantic, to a ship so large and so carefully engineered that the men who built her genuinely believed, or at least allowed the wider world to believe, that she was as close to unsinkable as any vessel could possibly be. We are going to the story of the Titanic, the largest moving object ever built by human hands at the moment of her launch, a floating monument to the wealth, the confidence, and the technological ambition of the Edwardian age, a ship that carried some of the richest and some of the poorest people in the world across the same dark ocean, bound together for 4 brief days by the same hopeful crossing toward a new life or a familiar homecoming on the other side. This is the story of a single voyage, the Titanic's first and only crossing, and of everything that came before it, the shipyards of Belfast, where she was built plate by riveted plate, the rigid, almost theatrical social hierarchy of the era that placed her passengers into carefully separated decks according to the size of their fortune and the strange, quiet convergence of small decisions, a wireless message set aside, a lookout without binoculars, a course held steady a little too long, that turned an ordinary crossing into one of the most studied disasters in modern history. It is a story about hubris and about ordinary human courage, in the same breath, about a ship's band that reportedly kept playing as the deck tilted beneath their feet, and about the cold, indifferent arithmetic of lifeboats that were never going to be enough for everyone aboard, regardless of how the following hours unfolded. It is a story that belongs to the night because it happened in the deepest part of one, on a sea so calm and so starlit that survivors would later describe the strangeness of it, the ocean like glass, the sky untroubled, the disaster arriving not in a storm but in a silence. Let it come to you now, slowly. Out of the cold Atlantic dark, the lights of a great ship glowing warm and steady across water that, for a little while longer, still holds no sign of what is coming. If these journeys bring you calm, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet hum of a great ship's engines come to you out of the darkness, steady and warm, carrying you gently across a calm and starlit sea. Let us begin. The world that produced the Titanic was one of extraordinary and, in retrospect, precarious confidence, a period historians often call the Edwardian era in Britain, named for King Edward VII, who reigned from 1901 until his death in 1910, though the Titanic herself would not sail until 1912 under the reign of his son George V, a period across both reigns characterized by rapid industrial and technological advancement, enormous and increasingly visible disparities of wealth between the industrial elite and the working poor, and a widespread, largely unshaken cultural faith in the idea that human engineering and progress were steadily, irreversibly making the world safer, faster, and more comfortable with each passing year. Harland and Wolff itself had grown, across the preceding half-century, into one of the most significant and most technically accomplished shipbuilding enterprises anywhere in the world, its Belfast yard employing, at the height of the Olympic-class construction program, somewhere in the region of 15,000 workers across the many specialized trades that heavy shipbuilding required, from riveters and platers working the ship's steel hull, to the carpenters, upholsterers, and decorative artisans responsible for fitting out her considerably more luxurious interior spaces, a workforce whose collective labor across more than 2 years of continuous construction represented one of the largest coordinated industrial undertakings of the entire Edwardian period, and whose own working conditions, involving genuinely significant occupational hazards including falls, crushing injuries, and fatal accidents that claimed the lives of several workers over the course of the Titanic's own construction alone, reflected the considerably harsher and less regulated industrial safety standards of the period more broadly, standards that stood in genuinely striking contrast to the luxurious comfort the same workers' labor was ultimately producing for the ship's future first-class passengers. The specific claim that the Titanic was popularly described as unsinkable deserves some careful historical qualification, since the phrase, while genuinely used in some contemporary trade publications and promotional materials describing the ship's advanced watertight compartment system, was considerably less prominent and less absolute in its original context than the popular post-war and later 20th century retelling of the disaster would eventually suggest, with most careful modern historians, concluding that the ship's reputation for near-total safety reflected a broader, more diffuse cultural confidence in the era's shipbuilding technology more generally, rather than any specific, officially sanctioned White Star Line marketing claim of absolute, literal unsinkability, a nuance that matters considerably for understanding the disaster's own subsequent cultural memory, since the popular narrative of an overconfident company explicitly promising an unsinkable ship makes for a considerably more dramatically satisfying story than the somewhat more mundane historical reality of an entire industry and its enthusiastic contemporary press simply overestimating, in a general and diffuse way, the practical safety margins that early 20th century shipbuilding technology had actually achieved. Transatlantic passenger travel had, by the early 20th century, become both a lucrative and a fiercely competitive business, with several major shipping lines, most significantly the British Cunard Line and the White Star Line, competing directly for the enormously profitable traffic of wealthy travelers, business passengers, and, in by far the largest raw numbers, the millions of emigrants leaving Europe each year in search of new economic opportunity in the United States and Canada, a mass migration that provided shipping companies with an enormously reliable and lucrative source of steerage class or third-class ticket revenue, even as the same companies competed publicly and loudly over the considerably more prestigious business of ferrying wealthy first-class passengers in ever more luxurious surroundings. Cunard's own two great record-breaking liners, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, both entering service in 1907, had claimed the coveted Blue Riband, the informal recognition awarded to the passenger liner completing the fastest transatlantic crossing, and had done so with a degree of publicity and national pride that stung the White Star Line's own commercial ambitions considerably, prompting White Star's chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, and the Belfast shipbuilding firm of Harland and Wolff, led by its chairman, Lord William Peary, to conceive of an entirely different competitive strategy during a now well-documented dinner meeting between the two men in 1907, deciding that rather than compete directly with Cunard on raw speed, White Star would instead build a new class of ships emphasizing unprecedented size, luxury, and stability. Ships designed to offer the smoothest, most comfortable possible crossing, rather than simply the fastest one, a strategic decision that would directly produce 3 sister ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, collectively known as the Olympic class, the wireless telegraph technology that would play such a genuinely consequential role in the disaster's own unfolding events was itself still a comparatively recent and commercially evolving innovation at the time of the Titanic's maiden voyage, with the Marconi Company operating wireless equipment aboard passenger vessels primarily as a commercial service allowing wealthy passengers to send and receive personal telegrams during their crossing, a genuinely popular and profitable novelty service in its own right rather than as a dedicated, purpose-built maritime safety system in the more thoroughly safety-oriented sense that later regulatory reform would eventually require a distinction in the technology's own original commercial purpose that helps explain several of the specific wireless-related failures and delays that this episode's later chapters will examine in connection with the disaster's actual unfolding. The broader cultural moment that produced this competitive dynamic reflected a genuinely widespread Edwardian-era faith in the capacity of modern engineering to conquer natural obstacles that had constrained human travel and commerce for the whole of prior history, a confidence reinforced by genuinely remarkable recent technological achievements, including the expansion of the international undersea telegraph cable network, the rapid development of wireless radio communication under the pioneering work of Guglielmo Marconi, whose own Marconi Company would play a small but genuinely significant role in the unfolding events of the Titanic's own final hours, and the steady, visible improvement in steamship engine technology, hull design, and navigational instrumentation across the preceding several decades, all of which combined to produce a cultural atmosphere in which the specific, now infamous claims of the Titanic's practical unsinkability, claims that were, in fact, somewhat more modest and more heavily qualified in their original contemporary sources than popular legend later remembered them, nonetheless found a genuinely receptive and enthusiastic public audience eager to believe that human engineering had, at long last, substantially tamed the ocean's ancient dangers. The social and economic world of Edwardian Britain and America that filled the Titanic's passenger decks was itself undergoing significant, visible strain beneath its confident surface, with the enormous fortunes accumulated by industrialists, financiers, and their families during the preceding decades of rapid industrialization increasingly visible and increasingly resented, alongside the genuinely difficult and precarious economic circumstances facing the working class and immigrant populations who filled the same ship's considerably less luxurious lower decks, a genuine social tension that the Titanic's own rigidly stratified passenger accommodations, physically separating first, second, and third-class passengers through locked gates and separate stairwells in ways that would prove tragically consequential once the ship began taking on water, reflected with an almost architectural literalness that later historians and commentators have found impossible to overlook when examining exactly how the disaster's casualties broke down along these same class lines. The rigid social hierarchy that structured Edwardian society more broadly found its most literal and consequential physical expression aboard the Titanic herself, where first-class passengers, paying fares that could reach several $1,000s for the most luxurious parlor suites, a genuinely enormous sum for the period, equivalent to many years of an ordinary working person's total income, enjoyed accommodations and amenities considered extraordinarily lavish, even by the standards of the era's grandest hotels, including a swimming pool, a squash court, a Turkish bath, multiple restaurants and lounges, and staterooms decorated in a range of elaborate historical styles, from Louis XIV to Georgian Revival, each individually designed by the ship's own team of decorators and craftsmen to evoke the appropriate atmosphere of established, inherited wealth and taste. Second-class passengers aboard the Titanic included a genuinely notable proportion of clergy, several of whom, according to widely reported survivor testimony, spent portions of the ship's final hour offering prayer and comfort to fellow passengers, rather than actively seeking their own place in the lifeboats, along with school teachers, small business owners, and other modestly prosperous professionals for whom the considerable expense of a first-class ticket would have been genuinely prohibitive, but who nonetheless valued and could reasonably afford a level of comfort and respectability during their crossing well above what the era's cheaper steerage accommodations offered, a passenger demographic that White Star Line's own marketing materials specifically targeted with language emphasizing respectable comfort rather than the more overtly ostentatious luxury used to advertise the ship's first-class accommodations. Second-class accommodations aboard the Titanic, while considerably more modest than first class, were themselves widely considered comparable to first-class accommodations on many other, less luxurious contemporary vessels, reflecting White Star Line's own deliberate marketing strategy of offering middle-class travelers, including clergy, teachers, and modestly successful business people, a genuinely comfortable and respectable crossing experience at a more accessible price point, complete with their own dedicated dining saloon, library, and promenade deck space, a considered middle tier in the ship's overall class structure that reflected the genuinely significant expansion of a prosperous, travel-capable middle class across both Britain and America during this same general period. Third class, or steerage, aboard the Titanic represented White Star Line's essential mass-market emigrant trade, and while conditions in Titanic's third class were, by the standards of the era's transatlantic emigrant trade more broadly, considered genuinely above average, including proper cabins, rather than the undivided communal dormitory spaces that had characterized steerage accommodations on older vessels, third-class passengers nonetheless occupied the lowest and most confined decks of the ship, furthest from the lifeboats stored on the uppermost boat deck, and were subject to strict segregation from the upper-class decks enforced through locked gates, ostensibly required by United States immigration law to prevent the spread of contagious disease from steerage passengers before proper medical inspection at Ellis Island, but which would, once the ship began sinking, create severe and, for many third-class passengers, ultimately fatal delays and confusion in reaching the boat deck where the lifeboats waited. The broader emigrant trade that filled third-class accommodations aboard vessels like the Titanic reflected one of the largest sustained mass migrations in modern history, with millions of Europeans driven by a combination of economic hardship, religious and ethnic persecution in parts of Eastern and Southern Europe, and the genuine promise of greater opportunity in the rapidly industrializing United States, crossing the Atlantic in steerage accommodations. Across the several preceding decades, a trade that shipping companies, including White Star Line, had learned to treat as a genuinely significant and reliable revenue stream in its own right, rather than merely an afterthought subordinate to the more prestigious first-class trade, even as the physical conditions and social status afforded to these same third-class passengers remained considerably and visibly inferior to anything offered further up the ship's own internal social hierarchy. The specific legal requirement for segregating steerage passengers from the ship's upper decks, generally justified at the time by reference to United States Public Health Service regulations intended to prevent the shipboard spread of contagious disease among the very large numbers of immigrants passing through mandatory medical inspection upon arrival at facilities, including Ellis Island, meant that gates and barriers separating third-class accommodations from the rest of the ship were a standard and, under ordinary sailing conditions, relatively uncontroversial feature of transatlantic passenger vessel design. During this period, a feature whose genuinely severe practical consequences only became fully apparent once the Titanic's own emergency made rapid, unobstructed movement toward the lifeboats a matter of literal survival rather than mere administrative inconvenience, a stark illustration of how ordinary bureaucratic and legal arrangements, entirely unremarkable under normal circumstances, can carry consequences of an entirely different and considerably more severe order once normal circumstances themselves catastrophically break down. The crew who staffed the Titanic, numbering close to 900 men and women across every department, from the engine room stokers, who shoveled coal into the ship's boiler furnaces in grueling heat, to the stewards and stewardesses who attended directly to passengers' daily needs, to the officers and deck crew responsible for the ship's actual navigation and operation, occupied their own distinct position within this same wider social hierarchy, generally recruited from Southampton's own considerable maritime working-class community, and paid wages that, while reasonably competitive for merchant maritime work of the period, reflected the same fundamentally unequal economic relationship between labor and capital that characterized the wider Edwardian industrial economy, from which both the ship's wealthy first-class passengers and its working crew equally emerged. This same rigid social stratification extended into the ship's dining and recreational arrangements with a thoroughness that later historians have found genuinely striking in its completeness, since first, second, and third-class passengers not only ate in entirely separate dining facilities, serving markedly different quality and variety of food, but were also provided with distinctly different qualities of promenade deck space, recreational facilities, and even distinctly different design and quality of tableware, bedding, and furnishing throughout their respective accommodations, a comprehensive physical embodiment of Edwardian class distinction that the ship's own designers and White Star Line's own marketing materials treated as an entirely unremarkable, indeed, a positively desirable and marketable feature of the whole travel experience, being offered to each distinct category of paying customer. The Titanic was constructed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, then still part of the United Kingdom, beginning with the laying of her keel in March of 1909, and continuing through a construction process that would eventually employ, at its peak, several thousand shipyard workers, laboring across more than 2 years to complete her hull, superstructure, and interior fitting out, a genuinely massive industrial undertaking that made Harland and Wolff's Belfast yard, and by extension the city of Belfast itself, one of the most significant centers of heavy shipbuilding industry anywhere in the world during this period, an economic and industrial significance to the city's own history and identity that has endured in various forms right through to the present day. The ship's construction employed cutting-edge shipbuilding techniques for the period, including a hull divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by transverse bulkheads that could be sealed by electrically operated watertight doors, controlled both individually and in an emergency, simultaneously from the ship's bridge, a safety feature that contemporary marine engineering, publications, and White Star Line's own promotional materials genuinely and not unreasonably praised as representing the most advanced damage control design of its era, since the ship was specifically engineered to remain afloat, even with as many as 4 of these 16 compartments completely flooded simultaneously, a design specification that would prove, in the specific and unusually unfortunate circumstances of the ship's actual sinking, tragically insufficient rather than fraudulently overstated, since the actual damage the ship would eventually sustain exceeded in its specific extent and pattern the particular flooding scenario against which this safety margin had been calculated. The considerable skilled craftsmanship invested in the ship's interior spaces extended to genuinely significant artistic and decorative commissions, including an ornate carved oak staircase in the first-class grand staircase area, topped by an elaborate wrought iron and glass dome, allowing natural light to filter down through several decks, a centerpiece of the ship's first-class public spaces that later became one of the most immediately recognizable visual symbols of the ship's lost luxury in subsequent popular retellings and cinematic depictions of the disaster, along with a considerable collection of fine art, furnishings, and decorative objects that passengers and crew alike would have encountered throughout the ship's many public rooms, virtually all of which was lost along with the ship herself, since the considerable time pressure of the sinking's final hours left essentially no opportunity for passengers or crew to attempt preserving any of the vessel's considerable material wealth beyond, in a small number of individually documented cases, particularly treasured personal possessions that specific passengers managed to carry with them into the lifeboats. The ship's launch, on the 31st of May, 1911, drew enormous crowds to the banks of the River Lagan in Belfast to witness the massive unpainted hull slide into the water for the first time, an event that, following standard Harland and Wolff practice for the period, notably did not include the traditional champagne bottle christening ceremony that many other shipbuilders and shipping lines favored, a fact that later, considerably more superstitious, popular retellings of the disaster would sometimes cite without any genuine historical or engineering basis whatsoever, as some manner of ominous portent, an entirely unfounded piece of after-the-fact folklore that responsible historians are careful to note reflected simply Harland and Wolff's own standard corporate launching practice rather than any meaningful omission specific to the Titanic herself. Following her launch, the Titanic underwent nearly a full additional year of interior fitting out work at Harland and Wolff's dedicated fitting out wharf, during which her engines, boilers, electrical systems, and the full range of luxurious passenger accommodations already described in the preceding chapter were installed and completed before the finished vessel underwent sea trials in early April 1912, tests that, following standard practice for the period and given the considerable financial and scheduling pressure to bring the enormously expensive vessel into profitable commercial service as promptly as possible, were considerably briefer and less exhaustive than modern maritime safety standards, would eventually require a further contributing factor that some later maritime historians have cited when assessing the broader institutional and industry-wide safety culture within which the Titanic's eventual disaster unfolded. The Titanic's propulsion system combined 29 coal-fired boilers feeding steam to her two massive, reciprocating engines and single central turbine, requiring a workforce of several hundred stokers and trimmers working in continuous shifts to keep the furnaces adequately fed throughout any given crossing, a physically brutal labor performed in intense heat deep within the ship's lower decks that stood in almost inconceivable contrast to the leisurely luxury being enjoyed by first-class passengers only a few decks above, and the ship's three enormous propellers, the outer two driven by the reciprocating engines and the central one by the turbine, gave her the distinctive combination of power and, by the standards of the era's largest vessels, relatively smooth and vibration-free running that contributed considerably to the reputation for comfort that White Star Line had specifically set out to cultivate with the whole Olympic-class design program. The Titanic was, in fact, the second of three planned sister ships in this Olympic class, following her slightly earlier sister, the Olympic, which had entered service in 1911, and which served as something of a practical proving ground for the design, since several modifications were made to the Titanic during her own construction based on lessons learned from the Olympic's own initial months of commercial service, including an enclosed forward section of her promenade deck intended to provide additional shelter from sea spray for first-class passengers, a modification that gives careful observers one of the few immediately visible external differences between the otherwise nearly identical sister vessels. The third sister, the Britannic, was still under construction at the time of the Titanic's own loss and would herself be requisitioned as a hospital ship during the First World War before being sunk, though with considerably fewer casualties given wartime safety improvements and more favorable circumstances by a naval mine in the Aegean Sea in 1916, an outcome that meant all three Olympic-class sister ships would eventually meet remarkably dramatic and, in two of the three cases, fatal ends within a span of only a few years of one another. The completed ship measured some 882 feet in overall length and displaced over 52,000 tons, making her, at the moment of her completion, the largest man-made moving object that had ever existed, powered by a combination of two massive reciprocating steam engines and a single central low-pressure turbine, together capable of driving the ship at a service speed of around 21 knots, considerably slower than Cunard's dedicated speed record vessels, but entirely sufficient to complete a competitive, comfortable transatlantic crossing within the standard scheduling expectations of the era's passenger trade, all while offering the vastly superior standard of onboard luxury and stability that had been White Star Line's own deliberate and, until the disaster itself, genuinely successful competitive strategy from the very outset of the Olympic-class construction program. command of the Titanic's maiden voyage was entrusted to Captain Edward John Smith at 62 years old already, the most senior and most experienced captain within White Star Line's entire fleet, a mariner who had commanded numerous previous White Star vessels across a maritime career stretching back several decades, and who was, by the standards of his era and profession, considered a genuinely respected and capable commander, sufficiently trusted by both his passengers and his employers that he had become something of an unofficial company tradition to have Captain Smith personally command each new White Star flagship vessel's own maiden voyage, a tradition that would make the Titanic's own maiden crossing, tragically, his final command before an already announced planned retirement from active sea duty. Smith's own long maritime career had not been entirely free of prior incident, including a notable collision several months earlier involving the Olympic and a British warship, HMS Hawke, in the Solent, an accident that a subsequent inquiry attributed substantially to the powerful suction effects generated by the enormous Olympic-class vessels' own displacement moving through relatively narrow, shallow coastal waters rather than to any specific negligence on Smith's own part, an episode that nonetheless meant Smith arrived at the command of the Titanic's maiden voyage with his own professional reputation already subject to some degree of prior scrutiny, even as his overall standing within White Star Line and among the traveling public remained genuinely strong enough that his command of the new flagship's maiden crossing was never seriously in question. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, traveled aboard the Titanic's maiden voyage himself as a first-class passenger, a decision that would later place him at the very center of considerable public controversy and criticism, since Ismay survived the sinking by boarding one of the last lifeboats to leave the ship, a decision that, given his position as the company's most senior executive, and given the broader unwritten social expectation of the period that men, and particularly prominent, socially significant men, should generally give way to women and children when lifeboat space was limited, subjected him to sustained and, in the view of many later historians, not entirely fair public criticism and personal disgrace for the remainder of his life, even though the specific circumstances of his own boarding, by his own testimony, and by several corroborating witness accounts presented to the subsequent official inquiries, involved him stepping into a lifeboat that had no other passengers immediately present and ready to board at that specific moment and location on the deck. The Titanic's ultimate ownership traced back to the International Mercantile Marine Company, a large American-controlled shipping trust assembled through the financial backing of the prominent American banker J.P. Morgan, who had acquired controlling interests in White Star Line and several other major shipping companies during the preceding decade as part of a broader, ultimately not fully successful strategic effort to consolidate and dominate the enormously lucrative transatlantic passenger and freight trade under unified American financial control, a detail of corporate ownership that meant the nominally British flagship vessel and her British crew were, in the underlying financial reality of the era's increasingly internationalized shipping industry, ultimately answerable to American capital and American corporate strategic priorities, though Morgan himself, having originally planned to sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage personally, canceled his own booking shortly before departure due to health concerns, narrowly avoiding what would otherwise have been his own personal presence at one of the era's most significant maritime disasters. The ship's senior officers beneath Captain Smith, including Chief Officer Henry Wilde, First Officer William Murdoch, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller, were themselves experienced professional mariners drawn from White Star Line's regular officer corps and the specific decisions and actions of these officers during the disaster's unfolding final hours, particularly Murdoch's own split-second decision-making in the immediate moments following the iceberg sighting, and Lightoller's own subsequent conduct in overseeing lifeboat loading on the port side of the ship, where he enforced an unusually strict interpretation of the traditional maritime protocol of women and children first, permitting almost no adult men to board, even when boats were launched with considerable remaining unfilled capacity, would become subjects of extensive and still ongoing historical analysis and debate regarding exactly how much individual human decision-making, as opposed to broader systemic and institutional factors, ultimately shaped the specific pattern of survival and loss that the disaster produced. Charles Lightoller, the ship's second officer and the most senior officer to survive the sinking, went on to a genuinely remarkable subsequent life and career that extended well beyond the Titanic disaster itself, serving with distinction in the Royal Navy during the First World War, and then, in one of the more remarkable footnotes to his own already eventful life, personally piloting his own small private motor yacht across the English Channel as part of the famous 1940 civilian flotilla that helped evacuate stranded British and Allied soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk during the early, desperate months of the Second World War, a genuinely striking instance of a single individual's own life intersecting directly with two of the 20th century's most historically significant maritime episodes, separated by nearly 3 decades, and Lightoller's own detailed subsequent testimony and later writing about his Titanic experience would remain one of the single most valuable and most extensively cited first-hand sources that later historians have relied upon in reconstructing the disaster's precise final hours. William Murdoch, the first officer who had the watch at the moment of the actual collision and who gave the immediate emergency helm and engine orders in the brief seconds following the iceberg's sighting, did not survive the sinking, and his own specific reputation suffered a genuinely unfair and factually unsupported posthumous injury. When the 1997 film depicting the disaster portrayed a fictionalized officer widely understood by audiences to represent Murdoch shooting a passenger before turning the weapon on himself, a dramatized sequence with no credible basis in the actual surviving historical evidence regarding Murdoch's own genuine conduct during the ship's final hour, a mischaracterization serious enough that the film's own production studio subsequently made a formal public donation and apology to Murdoch's surviving hometown community in Scotland in response to the resulting public criticism, a small but genuinely instructive illustration of the ongoing tension between the disaster's enduring value as popular entertainment and the continued responsibility that filmmakers and other storytellers bear toward the real, historical individuals whose lives and deaths their work depicts, the broader corporate and regulatory environment within which White Star Line operated during this period reflected a genuinely significant gap between The rapid pace of ship size and passenger capacity growth on the one hand, and the considerably slower, more conservative pace at which maritime safety regulations, particularly regarding the mandatory number of lifeboats a vessel of a given size was legally required to carry, had been updated to keep pace with this same growth. A regulatory lag that meant the Titanic, despite carrying more lifeboats than the outdated British Board of Trade regulations of the period actually legally required her to carry, nonetheless possessed lifeboat capacity sufficient for barely half of the total number of passengers and crew actually aboard on her maiden and, as it would tragically prove, only voyage. The Titanic departed Southampton on the 10th of April 1912, calling briefly at Cherbourg, France, and then at Queenstown, now Cove, in Ireland, to collect additional passengers before finally setting out across the open North Atlantic on her intended course toward New York, carrying, according to the most careful modern historical reconstructions of her final passenger and crew manifests, somewhere in the region of 2,200 people, total across all classes and crew departments combined, a precise figure that modern historians continue to refine and debate given the genuinely significant inconsistencies and gaps present in the surviving original passenger and crew records themselves. The crossing proceeded smoothly and, by all surviving passenger accounts, quite pleasantly for the first several days, with the ship's officers receiving, over the course of the 14th of April, a series of wireless messages from other vessels operating in the same general region of the North Atlantic, warning of considerable ice, including several specific reports of icebergs and extensive ice fields directly along or very near the Titanic's own intended course, warnings that were received by the ship's wireless operators and, in most, though notably not quite all cases, relayed to the bridge and to Captain Smith himself, but that did not result in any significant reduction in the ship's speed, which remained close to her maximum service speed of around 22 knots throughout the evening, a decision that later inquiries would examine in exhaustive detail, generally concluding that maintaining near maximum speed through a region with multiple, credible ice warnings reflected a broader industry-wide practice and expectation of the period rather than any specifically reckless or unusual decision unique to Captain Smith or the Titanic's own particular officers at approximately 11:40 in the evening, ship's time, on the 14th of April. Lookout Frederick Fleet, stationed in the crow's nest without the benefit of binoculars, which had been inadvertently left locked in a cabinet whose key had been misplaced by an officer who had been transferred off the ship before departure, a small but genuinely consequential logistical oversight that later inquiries specifically noted spotted a dark shape looming out of the calm, clear, moonless night directly ahead of the ship and immediately alerted the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch, who had the watch at that hour, ordered the ship's engines reversed and the wheel turned hard to attempt to steer around the obstacle. But the iceberg, despite these emergency maneuvers, struck the ship's starboard side in a glancing rather than head-on collision, a specific manner of impact that, counterintuitively, later engineering analysis would identify as considerably more dangerous to the ship's overall survival than a direct head-on collision would likely have been, since the glancing impact opened a series of relatively narrow but very extensive breaches along a considerable length of the hull, flooding 5, and by some later technical assessments, potentially 6, of the ship's 16 watertight compartments simultaneously, exceeding the 4-compartment flooding scenario against which the ship's watertight bulkhead system had been specifically designed to keep her afloat. The ship's list of received ice warnings across the 14th of April, when reconstructed carefully by later historians working from the surviving wireless logs and testimony, reveals at least 6 separate messages from other vessels operating in the same general region, reporting ice, of which several appear to have been received by the Titanic's own wireless operators, but not promptly or, in at least one especially significant case, ever forwarded to the bridge at all, since the ship's 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were, at the time several of these warnings arrived, considerably occupied processing a substantial backlog of paying passenger telegrams that had accumulated after the ship's wireless equipment had suffered a temporary breakdown earlier in the voyage, a mundane commercial priority that, in retrospect, carried genuinely serious safety consequences, including one particularly significant ice warning from the nearby Californian, sent at around 11 in the evening, that Phillips reportedly rebuffed with some irritation, informing the Californian's own wireless operator that he was busy with commercial traffic and instructing him to keep quiet, an exchange that led the Californian's wireless operator to shut down his own equipment and retire for the night only shortly before the collision itself occurred, removing that nearby vessel's own wireless capability from the picture at precisely the moment it would have mattered most. The exact sequence of the collision itself, reconstructed by later engineers and historians from surviving witness testimony, physical evidence recovered from the wreck, and subsequent computer modeling of the ship's specific hull design and the iceberg's most probable underwater profile, indicates that the impact, rather than tearing one long continuous gash along the hull as popular retellings have often suggested, instead produced a more complex pattern of intermittent buckling and separated hull plate seams across several adjacent compartments, allowing water to enter through a combined breach area that, while relatively modest in absolute total size, was distributed precisely along the specific pattern of compartments that overwhelmed the ship's watertight subdivision systems, particular design tolerances, a technical nuance that modern naval architects and marine forensic engineers continue to study closely as a genuinely instructive case study in exactly how a ship's specific damage pattern, rather than simply the raw scale of an impact, ultimately determines survivability. Captain Smith and the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who was himself traveling aboard the maiden voyage to observe the ship's performance and address any necessary adjustments, conducted a rapid inspection of the flooding damage within the first half hour following the collision, and Andrews, drawing on his own detailed knowledge of the ship's engineering specifications, reportedly informed Captain Smith with considerable and, as subsequent events would confirm, entirely accurate certainty that the ship was doomed and would sink within a relatively short and calculable period of time, information that prompted Smith's order, issued shortly after midnight, to begin uncovering and preparing the lifeboats and to have passengers roused from their cabins and directed toward the boat deck, an order whose own initial communication to many passengers, particularly in third class, was hampered by exactly the kind of physical and administrative class segregation already discussed in this episode's second chapter. The specific sequence in which the ship's 20 lifeboats were lowered, beginning with boats on the starboard side, under First Officer Murdoch's own more permissive interpretation of loading protocol, which allowed some men to board alongside women and children whenever no additional women or children were immediately present and waiting, and continuing through the port side under Second Officer Lightholder's own considerably stricter enforcement of the same women and children first principle, meant that the specific side of the ship from which any given passenger ultimately departed carried genuinely significant, if largely accidental, consequences for their own individual odds of survival, a further layer of essentially arbitrary circumstance compounding the already significant structural inequalities of class and gender already discussed elsewhere in this episode when determining exactly who lived and who did not survive that particular night. The following approximately 2.5 hours as the ship's bow progressively settled deeper into the calm, frigid water, while her stern rose correspondingly higher into the night sky, saw the loading and launching of the ship's 20 lifeboats, a process significantly hampered by insufficient crew training in the specific lifeboat loading procedures, by considerable initial passenger reluctance to board what still appeared, to many aboard a ship widely believed unsinkable, a considerably less safe option than remaining aboard the still largely intact and electrically lit vessel, and by the same strict, unevenly enforced interpretation of women and children first protocol already discussed, all factors that combined to see numerous lifeboats launched with considerably less than their full-rated passenger capacity. A specific and, in retrospect, especially tragic detail that later inquiries and subsequent generations of maritime safety reformers would identify as one of the disaster's most preventable and most costly individual failures. The Titanic finally sank beneath the surface of the North Atlantic at approximately 2:20 in the morning on the 15th of April 1912, breaking into two main sections during her final plunge, according to both surviving eyewitness testimony and the subsequent physical evidence recovered from the wreck site decades later, taking with her more than 1,500 of the roughly 2,200 people who had been aboard, the overwhelming majority of them men from second and third class, and among the ship's own crew, while first-class women and children survived at a dramatically higher rate, a stark statistical pattern of survival that later historians and sociologists have extensively analyzed as a genuinely revealing case study in exactly how class, gender, and the specific physical and procedural circumstances of a real emergency interact to determine, often quite brutally, who ultimately lives and who does not. Among the roughly 325 first-class passengers aboard the Titanic's maiden voyage were numerous individuals of considerable contemporary wealth and social prominence, including the American businessman John Jacob Astor IV, reputed at the time to be among the very wealthiest men in the entire United States, who did not survive the sinking, and the department store owner Isidore Straus and his wife Ida, who, according to widely reported survivor testimony, chose to remain together aboard the sinking ship rather than be separated when Ida refused to board a lifeboat without her husband, and Isidore, in turn, declined to take a seat that convention reserved for women and children, a specific act of mutual devotion that became, almost immediately following the disaster, one of its most widely reported and most enduringly remembered individual human stories. the considerably larger population of second and third class passengers, numbering together well over 1,500 individuals, included a genuinely wide range of ordinary working people and emigrant families from across the British Isles and continental Europe. Traveling toward new lives and, in many cases, toward family members who had already established themselves in the United States or Canada, and the statistical pattern of the disaster's casualties, in which third-class passengers and third-class men in particular perished at survival rates dramatically lower than any other passenger category, reflected the combined and compounding effects of their physical location deep within the ship's lower decks, the considerable additional time and distance required to navigate upward through unfamiliar and, in the ship's final chaotic hours, often locked or crew-guarded passageways toward the boat deck, and the same broader social expectation that women and children, but very much not men, should be prioritized for the limited available lifeboat seats, an expectation that inevitably interacted with the ship's own physical class segregation to produce outcomes that fell along lines of both gender and social class simultaneously, and in the specific data that later analysts have carefully compiled, quite starkly. Among the surviving first-class passengers, Margaret Brown, an American socialite who would later become popularly, if somewhat inaccurately in certain specific details, known to history and popular culture as the unsinkable Molly Brown, gained considerable contemporary attention for her active role in helping to organize and encourage the occupants of her own lifeboat, reportedly at one point urging the boat's designated crewman in charge to turn back and search for additional survivors in the water despite his own understandable reluctance, given the very real danger of being swamped by desperate survivors attempting to climb aboard, an episode that later became one of the numerous individual acts of documented courage and leadership that subsequent popular retellings of the disaster have particularly emphasized. Benjamin Guggenheim, a member of the wealthy American mining family, did not survive the sinking, and survivor accounts describe him and his male valet changing into formal evening dress once it had become clear the ship was doomed, reportedly informing a nearby steward that he and his companion wished to go down like gentlemen, a specific and widely reported detail that became, alongside the story of Isidore and Ida Strauss already discussed, one of the disaster's most frequently cited individual illustrations of the specifically Edwardian ideal of composed, dignified masculine conduct in the face of certain death, an ideal that the disaster's own subsequent cultural memory has treated with a mixture of genuine admiration and, among some later and more critical historians, a certain skepticism regarding how much such reported deathbed composure reflects authentic contemporaneous behavior as opposed to the kind of retrospective narrative smoothing that survivor testimony and early journalistic accounts alike are always somewhat prone to introducing into genuinely chaotic and poorly documented final moments. The Countess of Rothes, a British aristocrat traveling in first class, took an active hand at the tiller of her own lifeboat and helped row for several hours, another frequently cited example of the disaster's numerous instances of women, including women from the ship's most socially privileged class, taking on genuinely active and physically demanding roles during the emergency that stood in some tension with the more passive, protected role that contemporary Edwardian gender expectations might otherwise have assigned them, a tension that the disaster's own specific well-documented circumstances repeatedly exposed and complicated in ways that later historians examining gender roles during the disaster have found genuinely rich material for closer analysis. The Titanic's crew, drawn overwhelmingly from Southampton's own considerable maritime working community, included several hundred stokers and trimmers who labored in the ship's boiler rooms, shoveling coal into the furnaces that powered her engines, a physically brutal and dangerous job even under ordinary operating conditions. Alongside stewards, stewardesses, and other service staff who attended directly to passengers across every class, and the ship's musicians, employed not directly by White Star Line itself, but by a specialized musical contracting agency whose continued playing on the boat deck during the ship's final hour, a detail extensively corroborated by multiple independent survivor accounts. Even though the exact specific pieces of music played during the very final minutes remain a matter of some surviving testimonial disagreement, became one of the disaster's single most iconic and most frequently retold details in the many decades of subsequent popular retelling and commemoration that followed. The ship's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, employed directly by the Marconi Company rather than by White Star Line itself, played a genuinely crucial role in the unfolding disaster, transmitting the era's now standard distress signal, CQD, and in one of the first significant uses of the still newer alternative distress call, SOS, repeatedly throughout the ship's final hours, successfully summoning the Cunard liner Carpathia, whose own captain, Arthur Rostron, made the determined and, for a vessel of her own more modest speed capability, genuinely demanding decision to steam at considerably greater than her normal safe operating speed through the same ice-strewn waters to reach the Titanic's last reported position as quickly as humanly possible, arriving roughly an hour and a half after the Titanic had already gone under, and beginning the difficult work of recovering survivors from the ship's 20 scattered lifeboats across the cold, dark water. Life aboard the Titanic during her brief maiden voyage, before the disaster's own final hours, reflected the same rhythms of shipboard social life that characterized transatlantic passenger travel. More broadly during this period, first-class passengers dining in considerable luxury and socializing in the ship's various lounges and smoking rooms, second-class passengers enjoying their own more modest but still genuinely comfortable equivalent facilities, and third-class passengers gathering in shared common spaces for music, conversation, and the particular mixture of anxiety and hope that characterize the emigrant experience more broadly. An ordinary, largely unremarkable few days of shipboard routine, complete with concerts, card games, and the ordinary small talk of strangers slowly becoming shipboard acquaintances that makes the sudden, catastrophic disruption of the disaster's final hours all the more genuinely jarring when read against the considerable surviving documentary and testimonial record of exactly how uneventful and pleasant the crossing had, until that final night, actually been. The Carpathia's arrival at the Titanic's last reported position at approximately 4 a.m. on the 15th of April, roughly an hour and 40 minutes after the Titanic herself had finally disappeared beneath the surface, began a difficult and emotionally harrowing several hours of recovering the roughly 705 survivors scattered across the Titanic's 20 lifeboats, many of the survivors suffering from severe hypothermia and shock after hours spent in open boats on the frigid North Atlantic before the Carpathia, having abandoned her own original scheduled voyage entirely, turned back toward New York, carrying the survivors to a city that had, in the intervening hours, already begun receiving fragmentary and, in several initial newspaper reports, significantly inaccurate accounts of the disaster, including some early reports that had mistakenly suggested the ship had survived the collision with all aboard safe, inaccuracies that would only be definitively corrected once the Carpathia herself finally arrived in New York Harbor on the 18th of April, carrying the actual survivors and their first-hand accounts. The disaster prompted near immediate and, by the standards of the period, genuinely extensive official investigation on both sides of the Atlantic, with the United States Senate convening its own inquiry within days of the Carpathia's arrival in New York, chaired by Senator William Alden Smith, who called numerous surviving passengers and crew members, including J. Bruce Ismay himself, to testify regarding the specific circumstances of the disaster, while a separate and somewhat more technically detailed British inquiry, conducted under the auspices of the Board of Trade and presided over by Lord Mersey, examined many of the same questions from a British legal and regulatory perspective, both inquiries ultimately reaching broadly similar conclusions regarding the disaster's principal contributing causes, including insufficient lifeboat capacity relative to the ship's actual passenger and crew complement, excessive speed maintained despite credible ice warnings, and significant deficiencies in crew training and emergency procedure without either inquiry definitively assigning individual criminal culpability to any single specific officer or company, official. Considerable and still historically significant controversy has continued to surround the actions of the Leyland Line steamship Californian, which was operating in generally the same region of the North Atlantic on the night of the disaster, and whose own crew reportedly observed distress rockets fired from a nearby vessel, quite possibly, though not entirely conclusively, the Titanic herself, without taking action to investigate or render assistance, a failure that both official inquiries examined in considerable critical detail, and that has remained, in the more than a century since, one of the disaster's most persistently debated secondary controversies, with subsequent generations of maritime historians and disaster researchers continuing to examine the available navigational and testimonial evidence in ongoing efforts to more precisely establish exactly how close the Californian actually was to the sinking Titanic and exactly how culpable her officers' failure to respond to the observed distress signals genuinely was under the specific navigational and visibility conditions prevailing that particular night. The considerable public outrage that followed the disaster, particularly regarding the starkly evident insufficiency of lifeboat capacity relative to the ship's actual passenger and crew numbers, prompted comparatively swift international regulatory reform, most significantly, the negotiation and eventual adoption of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, generally known by its acronym SOLAS, first agreed in 1914 and subsequently revised and strengthened across numerous later international conferences throughout the 20th century, establishing new mandatory requirements, including sufficient lifeboat capacity for every person aboard a passenger vessel, regardless of the ship's own presumed structural safety margins, continuous 24-hour wireless radio watch aboard passenger vessels rather than the more limited operating hours that had left the nearby Californian's own wireless operator off duty, and asleep at the critical hour of the Titanic's own distress calls, and the establishment of a dedicated international ice patrol funded jointly by the maritime nations with significant transatlantic shipping interests to systematically monitor and report iceberg locations across the North Atlantic shipping lanes for the benefit of all vessels operating in the region, a set of concrete regulatory reforms that collectively represent perhaps the single most significant and most directly traceable, lasting practical legacy of the entire disaster. The Californian's own captain, Stanley Lord, maintained throughout both official inquiries and for the remainder of his own life that the vessel his crew had observed firing distress rockets could not have been the Titanic herself, given his own understanding of his ship's position relative to the Titanic's own last reported wireless coordinates, a defense that subsequent generations of maritime historians and specifically dedicated disaster researchers have continued to examine and dispute using increasingly sophisticated navigational reconstruction techniques with the weight of most modern, careful analysis, concluding that the Californian was very likely considerably closer to the sinking Titanic than Lord's own testimony suggested, close enough that a more alert and more actively investigated response to the observed rockets might plausibly have allowed the Californian to reach the scene and rescue additional survivors before the Titanic's own final plunge, though this specific conclusion, like so much else surrounding this particular secondary controversy, remains subject to genuine ongoing scholarly debate rather than universal consensus. The two official inquiries, broadly similar findings regarding contributing causes translated into concrete regulatory change with a speed that, by the standards of international maritime regulation, more generally, was genuinely remarkable, reflecting the sheer scale of public shock and outrage that the disaster's casualty figures had generated across both Britain and America, and the considerable press coverage devoted to the inquiry's own proceedings, including extensive verbatim newspaper reporting of Ismay's own testimony and that of numerous surviving officers and crew members, meant that the disaster's specific causes and specific individual and institutional failures became genuinely widely known and widely discussed matters of public record across both nations almost immediately, rather than remaining confined to specialist maritime or legal circles alone. A level of sustained public engagement with the technical details of a maritime disaster that few, if any, prior shipping accidents of any scale had previously generated. The resulting SOLAS Convention's specific new requirements, including mandatory lifeboat capacity, calculated according to the total number of persons aboard, rather than according to a ship's gross tonnage alone, which had been the considerably less protective standard. The outdated British regulations in effect at the time of the Titanic's own sinking had actually employed represented a fundamental philosophical shift in how maritime safety regulation approached passenger vessel design, prioritizing the practical, worst-case necessity of actually evacuating everyone aboard over the more theoretical, and as the Titanic disaster had so starkly demonstrated, potentially dangerously overconfident presumption that a sufficiently well-engineered vessel might never actually require her full passenger complement to abandon ship at all. The establishment of the International Ice Patrol in the years immediately following the disaster, funded through ongoing international agreement among the maritime nations with significant transatlantic shipping interests and initially operated using surface vessels before eventually incorporating aircraft and, in the modern era, satellite monitoring technology has continued in continuous operation ever since, systematically tracking iceberg locations and icefield boundaries across the North Atlantic shipping lanes each ice season and issuing regular warnings to commercial and passenger vessels operating in the region, a direct, still functioning institutional legacy of the disaster that has operated, according to the patrol's own records, without a single subsequent loss of life, attributable to iceberg collision among vessels that heeded its warnings in all the years since its founding, a genuinely remarkable practical safety achievement that stands as one of the disaster's most concretely successful and most enduringly overlooked lasting legacies. The Titanic's wreck itself remained entirely unlocated on the ocean floor for over 7 decades following the disaster, resting, as subsequent exploration would eventually confirm, at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, considerably beyond the reach of any diving or salvage technology available during the decades immediately following the sinking, until a joint American-French oceanographic expedition led by the American oceanographer Robert Ballard finally located and photographed the wreck site in September of 1985, confirming, among numerous other significant details, that the ship had indeed broken into 2 main sections during her final sinking, exactly as several surviving eyewitnesses had originally testified, a detail that some of the original official inquiry findings had initially been somewhat more skeptical of accepting at face value. Ballard's discovery and the numerous subsequent scientific and commercial expeditions to the wreck site that followed across the following decades have recovered extensive photographic, video, and, in the case of several commercially organized salvage operations that have generated their own considerable ethical controversy among maritime historians and disaster survivors' descendants alike. Physical artifacts from the debris field surrounding the ship's 2 main wreck sections, providing modern historians and marine engineers with an enormously detailed physical record that has allowed considerably more precise reconstruction of exactly how the ship broke apart and sank than had been possible relying solely on the original, sometimes inconsistent surviving eyewitness testimony alone, a debate over the ethics of recovering and commercially displaying personal artifacts from what is, after all, the actual gravesite of over 1,500 people that continues to divide maritime archaeologists, legal scholars, and the wider public to this day, even as the wreck site's own increasingly well-documented physical deterioration caused by specialized iron-consuming bacteria that modern marine biologists have specifically identified colonizing the ship's remaining metal structure suggests that the physical wreck itself will likely have disintegrated entirely within the coming decades, a slow, ongoing natural process that has itself become a significant subject of continued modern scientific study and public fascination. Robert Ballard's own successful 1985 expedition to locate the wreck was itself, as later became publicly known only some years afterward, conducted as something of a cover operation for a separate, classified United States Navy mission to investigate the wrecks of 2 lost American nuclear submarines, the Thresher and the Scorpion, in the same general region of the North Atlantic, with Ballard's own well-funded and publicly announced search for the Titanic serving as convenient public cover, allowing him to complete his own genuinely long-held personal ambition of locating the famous wreck using advanced deep-sea sonar and remotely operated submersible technology that his Navy funding had made available to him specifically for the classified submarine survey work, a genuinely remarkable piece of Cold War-era scientific and military history entangled directly with the Titanic's own subsequent rediscovery in ways that remained entirely unknown to the general public at the time of Ballard's initial widely celebrated announcement. Beyond James Cameron's own commercially dominant 1997 film treatment, the Titanic disaster had already inspired a considerable body of earlier cinematic and literary work, stretching back to within mere weeks of the disaster itself, including a remarkably rapid 1912 silent film produced with the direct involvement of an actual Titanic survivor, the actress Dorothy Gibson, who had been aboard the ship's maiden voyage and who wore, in a detail modern film historians find genuinely striking, the very same dress she had actually worn on the night of the sinking during her own subsequent film performance, reenacting the disaster only weeks later, alongside numerous subsequent film, television, and literary treatments across the following decades, including the influential 1958 British film A Night to Remember, based on the historian Walter Lord's own meticulously researched 1955 book of the same name, which many careful historians and disaster researchers continue to regard as among the most historically accurate and best researched cinematic treatments of the disaster ever produced, notably more restrained in its dramatic embellishment than several of the considerably more commercially successful later treatments that followed it. Modern memorial sites and museums dedicated to preserving the disaster's memory and physical legacy have proliferated across the decades since Ballard's rediscovery of the wreck, including dedicated museum exhibitions in Belfast, where the Titanic Belfast Museum opened in 2012 on the site of the very shipyard where the vessel was originally constructed, occupies a striking modern building whose faceted aluminum-clad exterior was itself designed to evoke the angular hull forms of the ships once built on that same waterfront and in several American and British port cities, with direct historical connections to the ship's construction, crew, or maiden voyage, alongside numerous smaller memorials to specific groups of victims, including memorials specifically honoring the ship's musicians, her engineering crew, who remained at their posts in the engine rooms to maintain electrical power for as long as possible during the ship's final hour, an act of documented professional dedication and courage that kept the ship's lights burning for the vast majority of her final sinking, and that considerably assisted the evacuation efforts still underway on the decks far above them, and the considerable number of third-class passengers and crew members whose individual names and stories, considerably less thoroughly documented in the disaster's earliest journalistic and historical treatments than those of prominent first-class passengers, have only gradually received fuller historical attention and commemoration across the more recent decades of continued scholarly and popular interest in the disaster's full human scope. The Titanic disaster's enduring cultural legacy, considerably disproportionate in its sustained popular fascination, even relative to other maritime disasters of comparable or even greater loss of life during the same general historical period, has found expression across an extraordinary range of subsequent artistic, cinematic, and popular cultural works spanning the entire century since the sinking, including numerous feature films, of which the 1997 film directed by James Cameron achieved a level of global commercial success and cultural penetration that introduced the disaster's basic narrative to entirely new generations of audiences considerably removed from the original historical event, and that remains, even decades later, among the highest-grossing films ever produced anywhere in the world, alongside numerous documentary treatments, museum exhibitions displaying recovered artifacts, and continued popular and academic historical writing and research examining seemingly every conceivable angle and detail of the disaster's causes, its human stories, and its lasting institutional and regulatory legacy. The disaster's particular and enduring hold on popular imagination reflects many cultural historians examining the phenomenon have suggested a combination of genuinely compelling narrative elements, rarely combined so completely in any single historical event, including the stark and dramatically legible class and gender dynamics of exactly who survived and who did not, the poignant human stories of individual passengers and crew members facing the disaster's final hours, with documented instances of both genuine heroism and, in certain specific and still debated cases, less admirable conduct, the sheer scale and technological grandeur of the vessel herself, contrasted against the ultimately quite modest and almost mundane physical cause of her sinking, a single iceberg encountered on an otherwise calm and unremarkable night, and the disaster's clear, well-documented function as a genuine historical turning point, after which international maritime safety regulation was fundamentally and permanently reformed in ways whose basic regulatory framework, considerably updated and elaborated across the following century, remains recognizably in force, governing international passenger shipping safety practice down to the present day, a genuinely rare combination of technological hubris, human drama, and lasting practical consequence that few other single historical disasters have ever managed to combine within quite so tightly compressed and quite so thoroughly documented a span of only a few short hours. The Titanic, resting still on the dark ocean floor, some 400 miles south of Newfoundland, slowly returning across these coming decades to the iron-rich mineral compounds from which she was originally forged, remains even now, over a century after that calm, clear, and ultimately catastrophic April night, one of the single most thoroughly documented, most extensively studied, and most enduringly resonant disasters in the whole of modern history, a story that continues to be told and retold precisely because it combines, in one single tightly compressed, few hours of documented human experience, so many of the largest and most enduring questions any human society ever has to face about fortune, about class, about courage, and about the genuine. And so, we leave the Titanic resting in the dark water of the North Atlantic, a little over 400 miles south of Newfoundland, where she has rested now for well over a century. We stood in the Belfast shipyards, watching her hull take shape, rivet by careful rivet, and we walked her decks during those first calm days of her only voyage, through the gilded first-class dining saloons and the crowded, hopeful third-class common rooms alike, each deck carrying its own separate slice of the same wide, hopeful Edwardian world. We felt the iceberg's glancing, almost gentle first impact, and we watched Thomas Andrews do the quiet arithmetic that told him, and then Captain Smith, exactly how many hours remained. We considered the genuine competing threads of blame and circumstance, the ice warnings relayed too slowly, the binoculars locked away, the Californian sitting quiet and dark not so very far off, each a small human failure that, on any other night, might have made no difference at all, and each one that, on this particular calm and clear night, compounded into something no single decision alone could have produced. We stood among the lifeboats as they were lowered, some crowded and some, tragically, nearly empty, and we heard, as so many survivors reported hearing, the band still playing steadily, even as the deck beneath their feet began to tilt. We watched the Carpathia come steaming hard through the same dangerous ice-strewn water to gather up whoever the cold Atlantic night had left for her to find. These are human stories. The passengers were human, wealthy and poor alike, and so were the stokers shoveling coal far below the waterline, and the wireless operators tapping out their signals into the dark, and the officers making split-second decisions with only the information they actually had in hand, not the fuller picture that a century of subsequent careful research would eventually assemble, and the whole vast, confident, ultimately quite fragile world that built this one great ship and then watched, in a single clear and calm night, exactly how much of the ocean's old power that confidence had never actually managed to tame. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video, or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue and let the old world keep talking in its old slow voice. One more calm crossing after another, one more quiet harbor light, glowing steady in the dark for as long as you need it to. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The lights below the waterline have long since gone dark. The band has set down its instruments. The last lifeboat has been pulled aboard the Carpathia, and the cold Atlantic night has gone quiet and still again. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open slowly, the way hands open when a long, hard night has finally, at last, come to its end. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like calm, dark water, closing gently over something that has finally, after so long, been allowed to rest. Somewhere out on that dark, cold stretch of the North Atlantic, 400 miles south of Newfoundland, the wreck still rests tonight, slowly settling further into the silt and the dark, patient the way all old ruins are patient, waiting for nothing in particular, indifferent now to whichever new generation of divers, historians, or curious late-night listeners next thinks to come looking for her. Sleep well, and good night. Wherever in this quiet, wide world, tonight's old story finds you resting.